Good evening. My name is Mitch Robertson and I'm a fellow here at the RAI Institute at the University of Oxford. I'm delighted to welcome you to this next event in our America Decides series. We'd like to thank you as well, the US Embassy in London, for their support of this series. To hear more about any of these events, please go to our website at rai.ox.ac.uk/election2020. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening for discussion of race and the 2020 election, a year in which calls for racial justice have grown ever louder in the United States of America. We're delighted for this discussion to have three distinguished guests tonight. First, we have Maria Givens, who is a member of the Coeur d'Alene Northern Idaho tribe and is presently the Communications and Public Relations Director for the Native American Agriculture Fund. We're also delighted to be joined by Nazita Lajevardi, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Michigan State University, whose expertise is the attitudes of the American public towards members of marginalized communities. She's most recently the author of Outsiders at Home, The Politics of American Islamophobia. We're also very much looking forward to welcoming Nazita to join us in 2021-22, when she'll be the John G. Wynand Visiting Professor of American Government here at Oxford. We're also soon to be joined by Wesley Lowery, who is just a few minutes away, but I'll introduce him first. So Wesley is a journalist at CBS News. He previously worked at the Washington Post, where he led the newspaper's Fatal Force project on police shootings, which was recognized with the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for journalism. He's the author of They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement. We'll get started with our first question to Nazita. So Nazita, you wrote in 2017, with the election of Donald J. Trump as president, Muslim Americans may face the most pronounced threat to their collective political well-being in history. 4 years later, and on the eve of the end of Trump's first term, how do you assess this prediction?
Thank you so much, Mitch, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. Well, I think that the answer is quite clear. The first act that the president took in his first week in office was to issue a series of executive orders, and the Muslim ban that it so became called later on was one of these first executive orders. So within 1 week of taking office, the president targeted Muslims. 2017 was an extraordinary year. There were 3 different versions of a Muslim ban that were issued. And the last one was actually upheld by the Supreme Court in Trump versus Hawaii. So prospects are looking slim. What we've seen, especially in that first year of the election, was heightened hate crimes that targeted Muslim Americans throughout the country. We've also seen an increase in the introduction of anti-Sharia laws being introduced in our state legislatures. We should also be incredibly concerned with the fact that the president has attacked and vilified 2 Muslim women who now serve in the House, and it's incessant. It doesn't stop. He takes every chance he can to otherize and target these women. So I would say, the prediction was correct. It has been an incredibly dire administration for Muslim Americans. You're muted, Mitch.
Sorry for that. And thank you to Wesley Lowery for joining us. Now, we're delighted to have you.
Of course, so sorry for the delay.
Not a problem, thank you. Now to Maria, if I can ask you. Now you wrote a tremendous article for Vox about the absence of Native Americans and Native American issues in the 2020 campaign, which I would recommend to all who are here tonight. But just for our audience who may be unaware, what are the key issues at stake for Native Americans in 2020?
Definitely. I think one of our biggest issues is being invisible. A lot of people don't talk about us. When people list off minority groups in America, we're very rarely on the list of minority groups because people just don't think of us. So that's a major issue in policymaking because our issues don't get addressed when we're not thought of. But I think when we're thinking of the nitty-gritty policy things, healthcare is a major issue in Indian country, especially since COVID has really ravaged a lot of Native communities, especially the Navajo Nation in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And also just leading up to the election, there are a lot of things out there trying to inhibit Native people from voting. Native people live in very rural areas, and the postal system just works differently in those rural areas. So mail-in ballots, it's just a totally different system out there. So I think those are two of the main big issues that I'm hearing of right now.
Lovely, thank you very much. Now to Wesley, if I may. At these election events, one of the questions that we keep getting from our audience is about the Black Lives Matter movement and what effect that it's going to have on the 2020 election. So could I ask you that question, please?
Of course, I think that's a great question. I think that before I answer that, I want to contextualize a little bit and talk about some of the impact it had on the 2016 election, so I can draw in some ways some contrast, right? If we think about Black Lives Matter, it really came into the national consciousness in 2014, following the deaths of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice, and then continued to build momentum across the country in 2015 and 2016, following the deaths of Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Philando Castillo, Alton Sterling, right? And there are many number of other names and other protests, but they became a political player in 2014 through 16. And I think that at the time, two things were true. This was, while Black Lives Matter certainly had some support among white liberals, this was at the time a very largely a movement that really spoke to Black Americans primarily. When you look at the polling from the time, this was something that white Americans across the political spectrum remained relatively skeptical of, and yet many young Black voters emboldened and mobilized by this movement and by these conversations. In the 2016 election, there were a few different impacts of the movement. The first was that Democratic candidates, specifically Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, felt like they had to some extent cater to these young Black activists, and so it moved them a bit. Secondly, young Black voters felt particularly emboldened in the moment, and we know that those feelings were used by both the Trump campaign as well as the Russians to try to suppress Black votes. And so the thought here was that you would focus very heavily on Hillary Clinton's super predator comments to continue to lean into the racial division in the states. And you had a lot of young Black Americans in that moment who felt as if they shouldn't compromise on these issues and didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. The third thing, though, is that at the time, you had a lot of white Americans who were very skeptical of the conversations happening, were very defensive of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and were very horrified by violence in the streets. Massive protests at many times led to riots. And when you look at the American calendar, you see in the election year, in 2016, you have violence in the streets of Charlotte, in Milwaukee, in Dallas. You have massive protests that at times turns violent. And again, if you look at the Trump coalition, and at the time, he certainly, two major components of his coalition are ethnic white blue-collar voters, cops and firefighters, union white Democrats, for former Democrats, and white suburbanites. And what we know about the American society is that if you're a white suburbanite, chances are it's because you or your parents or your grandparents fled the city in the late 60s or 70s in response to violence in the cities following, in the midst of the civil rights movement, as well as following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And so, or in response to school desegregation. And so what we saw was the movement, while it was laying the groundwork for what we're seeing today, there's an argument to be made, very likely helped Donald Trump, White House. When we fast forward 4 years, what we see is that the political landscape of the states have changed significantly. We have a broader swath of people who are extremely upset about Donald Trump in a few different ways, right? Whether that's the young Black activist who at the time perhaps arrogantly thought, well, what's the difference between him and Hillary Clinton? Some of that was based in the belief that he could not win. And so it felt like a theoretical conversation, not a real one, who have been horrified time and time again by what's happened. You've had 4 additional years of these cell phone videos and these incidents over and over and over again. And in a number of cases during the Trump years that are in which the innocence of the person involved is extremely unquestionable. And so, for example, often in this conversation, we don't talk about Botham Jean in Texas, who was walking into his own apartment. The police officer was in his apartment and shoots and kills him. Or other way around, he's in the apartment, she walks in his apartment. Atiana Jefferson, who is watching, is watching television. The police officer shoots her through the window. And then when we get to George Floyd, which we watch, the knee being laid on his neck. And so the movement itself gains a broader, more complex support. We see following George Floyd, for the first time, a majority of white Americans in the polling support Black Lives Matter, believe that there's systemic racism. Again, what we're seeing here is white Americans are catching up to the belief systems that Black Americans have held in polling indefinitely. Well, so what we see in this moment, while in 2016, there's a chance that Black Lives Matter was at the very least a neutral force, mobilizing Republicans as much as Republican Trump voters as much as they did Clinton voters. It seems very unlikely that's what we're looking at now. That the events of this summer play to a Democratic and liberal base that has been upset and in the streets for the entirety of the Trump administration becomes one of the latest reasons to show up to vote against him. And also, it becomes a compelling reason for Black Americans to make sure they show up in this moment.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Now, I just sort of mentioned earlier, but please do use the Q&A function for our audience if you've got any questions for our panelists, and they'll come through to me and I'll ask them. Now, my second question I wanted to talk about something which has loomed large over 2020 is COVID-19. We can see from abroad the devastating impact that it is having on America writ large. As of this recording, there are 8.7 million cases in America, 225,000 deaths, and 60,000 new cases a day. But often overlooked is the impact of this pandemic is specifically having on marginalized communities. So I just wanted to ask the panel about that. So Maria, could I start with you, just the impact of COVID-19 on Native American communities?
Definitely. COVID has impacted Native American communities at higher rates than any other community in America. And what's important to understand is the nuances with Native American healthcare in the States is that the federal government has a trust and treaty obligation to Indian tribes to provide healthcare. So there's an Indian Health Service within the Department of Health and Human Services, and that administers the healthcare in Indian country. But it is super underfunded, understaffed in these rural areas. And it has taken so long for the COVID relief money to get to Indian country. So tribes weren't getting COVID relief until about April or May, when these bills were passed in February and March. So we've seen it at Navajo, we've seen it in North and South Dakota. All of these places it's playing out. On the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, the tribal chairman wanted to close down the borders of the reservation so cases wouldn't come into their community. And the governor of South Dakota did not want that to happen and ordered the reservation to open. So these tense local issues are really being distressed even more with COVID. And so it's definitely top of mind for everybody. People in my own community that I grew up with have been diagnosed and are recovering, but it's everywhere. And it's making its way out to rural America and into Indian country as well.
Thank you. Nazita, may I ask you?
Sure. So I think it's really important when we think about American Muslims, especially, to think about the diversity within the community. So a fifth of American Muslims are African American. About a third identify as between white and Middle Eastern. Another third identify, between 20 and 30% identify as South Asian. We have like 7% that are part Latino. So we're talking about an incredibly racially diverse group of people. And we're also talking about an incredibly diverse group of people in terms of socioeconomic status as well. So COVID has, the way that it's hit groups along racial lines has also affected the Muslim community. The brothers and sisters who are African American are going to be hurt in one way. The brothers and sisters who are South Asian are going to be hurt a different way, right? So on and so forth. But what we do know, I think, as my colleagues on this panel will likely agree with, is that people of color have been disproportionately affected by COVID in the United States, especially folks who are immigrants, especially folks who have lower or less access to healthcare. We're talking about people who are more likely to live in mixed family dwellings. So this is incredibly important. Much of the immigrant population that identifies as Muslim lives in these dwellings. These dwellings are known for folks coming in and leaving the homes at higher rates. And so there's more likelihood of exposure. And on top of that, we have a large undocumented population as well within the American Muslim community. So access to healthcare is obviously going to be sought out less by folks who are afraid of any sort of legal ramifications to their status here in the United States and fears of deportation. So these are concerns that I think a lot of us are concerned with. The final thing I will say is that there's also a great deal of COVID that is touching the Muslim community through the diaspora. So there's a lot of people who are still related to and are separated from their families through, for instance, the Muslim ban, right? Who are losing their lives. I mean, it's touched my own family. An uncle died, in Iran. There's nothing that we can do, that nobody can come and go in normal times, let alone in these COVID times. So I think it's rather important to understand the heterogeneity of this group and the ways in which COVID can be touching their lives and through all these different mechanisms.
Thank you very much. And now, Wesley, if I can ask you about African American communities.
Sure. Well, what we know is, COVID is not a racist disease. It's not floating through the air searching out people of color to kill. Rather, COVID is a mirror, right? It reflects back to us the realities of health in our nation to begin with. All right. And so the people who were the most vulnerable, the most underserved by our health systems the day before the pandemic are the ones who have been hit the hardest in any number of ways, right? And so what we've seen as it relates to African Americans is an exploitation by this disease, by this virus, of the structural vulnerabilities that have long existed. When you talk about African Americans, and this is not different from Native people, certainly, and many immigrant groups as well, right? When you talk about African Americans, you're talking about groups of people who often live in places without access to healthcare, who often are, or regular healthcare, who are often unable to pay the costs because they may or may not have insurance, which then means they are also very often not receiving preventative care. And so when you start looking at things like hypertension, overweight, issues with heart and cardio health, the types of things that made COVID more deadly, you are talking about the things that show up routinely in African American communities because of lack of access to healthcare and preventative healthcare. You are seeing, when you look at African Americans, you are seeing people who, when they live in urban environments, very often based on the way American housing works, have been forced into environments with dirtier and more toxic air and places and things. And so therefore you have, for example, asthma rates in African American communities that are significantly higher than elsewhere. In rural communities, you're often take that back, in urban communities, You're also very often talking about places that are what we consider food deserts without access to nutritious food. Um, Again, contributing to all of the type of things that make someone particularly vulnerable. And then in rural areas across the South, you are seeing what are kind of hospital deserts, places where it might be one hospital for 3 or 4 counties, and also places where you have what are essentially nutrition deserts as well, where it's difficult often to get the type of food that you should be eating. So all said, what we've seen in the numbers is uh, a small community. What people forget sometimes, I think, when we talk about Black Americans in comparison to white Americans, is that in our heads we almost pretend as if they're the same. They're two groups of similar size, right? But what you're talking about is, and we think about that when we think about disparity. What we're forgetting is that African Americans are a relatively small group of Americans, a relatively small group of our percentage of the population. And so what you end up seeing is that we have something like 1 in 1,000 Black Americans have died of COVID. I even just anecdotally, as someone who knows a lot of Black people, my Facebook feed every day is someone whose loved one, whose friend, I've constantly had firsthand contact with people who are dealing with COVID, which is different than for what's true for a lot of Americans. And then, and so what we've seen is that some of the places that have been hit the hardest, many of the places that have been hit hardest, are among the Blackest places. That Albany, Georgia, had an infection rate that matched Wuhan, China, at the heart of it, right? And so I think that, but again, what I say to frame all that is, it's not that COVID's seeking out Black people. It's that America has left Black people uniquely vulnerable through centuries of policy.
Thank you. So next question is, I think a critical element of the discussion about race in 2020 is the role of the state, and specifically police in their relationship to marginalized communities. Wesley, I think I'll start with you for this one, if I can. I mentioned in your introduction earlier, you're integral to the Washington Post Fatal Force project. Just wondering about how you think that conversation has changed in 2020, or if it has.
So the conversation certainly has changed. I think there is some backlash to it still, and I think it will be a mobilizing factor for some of the Trump voters. What we've seen is that questions around law enforcement, when you look at the polling, are extremely partisan. That Republicans are extremely defensive of police, defensive of law and order. They are mobilized by this messaging. Democrats are almost completely the inverse of that. That if the world was run exclusively by Republicans, there'd be no movement on any of these issues. If it was run exclusively by Democrats, we might actually be abolishing the police. And so so you have two groups of people existing in completely different spaces. And so what you see is that these issues end up mobilizing a bit of everyone. What we're going to see, I think what we see in this moment, right, is Donald Trump and his campaign have attempted to use this conversation twofold. One, to mobilize what they consider to be their voters, white suburbanites, white union Democrats, and law enforcement supporters. He also has attempted to use these issues to suppress votes for Democrats. This is why you see such a focus during debates on things like the crime bill or Kamala Harris's record, right? These are not actually plays to Black voters to vote for Donald Trump. Rather, they're plays to Black voters to stay home and not vote for Biden and Harris. And it's going to be interesting. Again, it seems. I try to avoid any prognostication, but thus far it seems as if that has been less effective this time around than last time around. Obviously, we'll find this out in a week. But it does seem, at least in my reporting, that the Democratic coalition seems like it's going to hold together much more than it did in 2016. Example of that is that I have trouble naming third-party candidates in this race. While we were all very well aware of Jill Stein and others the last time around, and I think that we have not seen in the Black space, we have not seen a liberal, progressive, black luminary come out and attack the Biden-Harris campaign at all. while in 16 you were seeing very prominent Black thought leaders writing extremely critical pieces of the Clinton campaign, even in the general election, post the primary. You had a lot of Bernie supporters speaking very openly about how they could not or did not or would not support her. We are not seeing that the way we saw it 4 years ago. And you had a thought among a lot of the young Black leaders who were mobilized around Ferguson and other things that they might sit out, that they weren't going to punch a ticket for Hillary Clinton. We don't see any analogous energy towards Biden and Harris again, because I believe that there's a different understanding of the stakes of this race. That one thing that comes up very often when you talk to activists in this space is that you vote for the person you want to fight against, right? And you would much rather, if you are an activist on these issues, have a Democratic administration that's too moderate for you that you drag to the left than a Republican administration that doesn't listen to you at all, tries to throw you in jail and undo all the progress you've ever made. And so faced with those choices, it's unsurprising to me that people in Black Lives Matter have kind of held the line this time around based on the lessons of 2016.
Now, Nazita, can I ask you that question? I know in the past you've written a lot about racial profiling. Perhaps.
Yeah, so if I may, I kind of want to talk a little bit about intersectionality, if that's all right. I think as we think about law enforcement and interactions with that marginalized groups might have with law enforcement, it's important to realize that there's state and local law enforcement, and then there's federal law enforcement. And it is completely plausible that you will have state, local, and federal law enforcement targeting you all at once. And it is entirely possible that you hold a multiple set of identities, that you are in an intersectional space where you will actually feel the brunt of the law in all these domains. And so if I can just, take us back to Wisconsin, to Kenosha, Wisconsin, we can talk about Jacob Blake for a second. Jacob Blake's father, Jacob Blake, for those of you who don't know, was shot, I think 7 times by police officers as he was walking to his car. He had his children in the car, and at very close range, he was shot. And his father begun a press conference by reciting a surah from Quran. And most people would not assume that this Black man being targeted by the police has any affiliation with like a Muslim identity, right? But the reality is that your Muslim identity doesn't necessarily have to showcase itself, right? It doesn't have to be front and center, but a person who's already dealing with, racial and gender discrimination and sits there might also have something else that might be attracting discrimination. And so I think as we talk about policing in this country, we have to realize that there are so many different parts of our identity that are going to attract violence from the police that we see in the United States right now. I mean, if you think about a person who may occupy a Black immigrant male role, right, and an identity, that person might actually also be, pursued by federal law enforcement as well. The USA Patriot Act created enormous powers for federal law enforcement. They really have set up federal law enforcement in a heightened position of power where they survey Muslims, they entrap Muslims, they have come into our schools, our MSAs, our Muslim Student Associations, right? There's many different forms of policing that manifest at this federal level. There are warrantless wiretaps that have infinite and indefinite gag orders on them. And so imagine operating your daily life being a person of color who's likely to be, targeted to begin with. And now you have these additional concerns of federal law enforcement. I think certainly there's an additive effect of vulnerability, but there might even be an exponential effect, right? This is something we don't know. What is it actually doing to people? And I think these are questions worthy of consideration, especially as we move forward. And we cast a ballot for 2 very different visions of what the relationship between marginalized groups and the police is going to look like. My own research has shown that when police officers are descriptively representative of the communities they police, there's more trust in law enforcement. It's not heightened like tremendously, but it's there. There's more trust that having people from members of your community helps. On the flip side, there's also research out there showing that when Latino law enforcement represents ICE, they're highly represented in ICE officers, it actually creates more suspicion because Latino populations are suspicious that, there's undercover officers among members of their own community where they should feel safe. So, I think that these are important questions moving forward. I would say we're at an impasse, I think only time will tell, but these are important considerations.
Thank you. And Maria, I can send the question over to you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both of what Nazita and Wesley are saying. And I think the really important thing to understand that where this tension comes from is a history of mistrust. There is, for Native people, there's 500 years of history of violence against Native American people that America was built on. You would not have the United States of America if it were not for that violence. So I think that that is inherited over the generations, and everyone has a story, whether it was something in the 60s at protests or whether it's today. And so Native people in particular have a big mistrust of the federal government specifically. And to Nazita's point, there are the jurisdiction of America, there are layers and layers of possible discrimination. And, in tribal communities, tribes are governments listed in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, that tribes are governments, and we have our own police force, and tribal police are so much more trusted than when the FBI comes in because of the federal relationship with tribes. It is the FBI that is the secondary jurisdiction. And so there is a lot of violence, there's a history of violence, and this is nothing new for our communities, and it just happens to be filmed now. And I think that's the main issue that I'm seeing is that, I talk to my mom or people who are of a different generation, and they're like, yeah, this was happening. And especially for Native American communities, there's a plague of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that has centuries of history behind it. When we think of individuals like Pocahontas, who was a young teenager who was taken from her village in Virginia and taken to England. She was kidnapped. And so that is taking place again today. And these cases are going unsolved because people are not taking this seriously. They don't believe that this violence is happening against Native women. And how can you trust a police force if they're not even going to take something seriously as a sister or a mother going missing? So I think that is one of the major justice issues happening in my community. And it is definitely impacting how people are viewing this election.
Thank you. We're getting a few questions on the chat asking about the impact of voter suppression in the 2020 election. So I don't know if anyone would particularly like to take that first.
Sure. What we know is that there are hundreds fewer places to vote in the years since. So this year than even just 4 years ago. Again, to set the table, we have to, when we consider voter suppression in this moment, we have to think of a few things. One, the door that was opened when the Supreme Court in Shelby versus Holder in 2013 struck down the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, which meant that a suite of southern states that had histories of suppressing the Black vote no longer had to get changes they made to the function of elections approved by the Justice Department. This immediately led to a wave across the country of voter ID laws, to rollbacks of things like early voting, automatic voter registration, the types of things that various states had begun implementing. And now what we see in this moment is a handful of things, right? So the first is that we have plenty of states that are operating under such laws that have been passed in the year since Shelby. So you have to think about that to begin with. Secondarily, what we're seeing across various states is the closing or alteration of polling places, right? When we think about someone's ability to vote, you have to think about where they're going. Is it convenient? Does it have the capacity for the number of people? Is it going to be staffed properly to make voting a seamless process? If you are someone who wants a certain type of people to vote less or have fewer of their votes counted, it's fine with you if the person shows up to vote and then leaves in frustration, right? That's the same thing as convincing them never to vote in the first place. And so what you see, when we see these long lines across the country, people like to hold that out as like a symptom of the strength of democracy, when in fact it speaks to the failures of democracy, that voting should be simple for each person. As opposed to complicated. You should not have to sacrifice 6 hours of your day and not go to work at X, Y, and Z. What we're also seeing is efforts to purge voting rolls across the country. What this does is it says that if you have been inactive or you haven't voted in the election, if you are a low propensity voter, that you can be removed from the voter registration rolls, meaning that if you show up on election day, in most cases, you can't then cast a ballot. What that does, however, is that has a different and a disparate impact depending on who you are. If you are someone who is poor, who moves frequently, who does not necessarily vote in local elections, but shows up every 4 years to vote in a presidential election, right? The types of voters who, again, knowing what we know about the populace, tend to be Democratic voters as opposed to Republican voters. Suddenly you vote up, suddenly you show up and you're enabled to cast your ballot. And so we've seen issues with voting purges as well.
We know that voter ID laws, they disproportionately target voters of color, the elderly, the poor, Democrats, really. Like, we know this, right? We've shown this. There's some disputes about causality. We'll never really get there. At some point, the propensity of the evidence is showing us this. We also know, of course, that there's other tactics. There's felon disenfranchisement laws. There's a number of different tactics that Wesley has just drawn our attention to. But I'd like to just, for one moment, talk about two different things. The first is that Senator Mike Lee, in the first week of October, a senator who is an attorney who has taken an oath to defend this Constitution of ours, wrote in a tweet that democracy is not the objective. He questioned whether democracy is the objective of our polity. This is really, quite frankly, I think, a moment for us to really question whether we're all fighting for a democracy, because we're there. We've actually arrived to this moment where, the democracy is on the ballot. Whether we still buy into this polity is on the ballot. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to raise is that last week a reporter called me to ask about, what do I think about the fact that the GOP has now hired armed militia to go and to stand and to monitor the polls, essentially what amounts to voter intimidation with weapons. And so this is another thing that is now manifesting today as a form of voter suppression. There are people who are showing up to the polls with weapons in order to cause fright in voters. And I think that, it's not necessarily that there's, only state tactics and legislation that's being passed that clearly violate what would have been Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act if it was still intact, right? It's not just that. We have other tactics that are being employed today to intimidate voters, right? And I think that the fact that we're talking about the fear of one's life, no longer do I have the right ID today? Am I going to have to wait in line today? But might I get shot? Might I die today? These are questions that, I think ring true for a lot of people who are considering whether they're going to show up to vote in person or not. And I think they need to be taken quite seriously.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very difficult to think about all of this politics in America when, like Nazita said, the very foundations are in question. And so it's not how to build the more perfect union, it's about, do we still have a union? And so I think that as I'm thinking of the election and Native voters live in a lot of these swing states where a lot of this stuff is happening. In Michigan, we all know what happened with the governor in Michigan and some folks who wanted to kidnap her. And thinking two things about Michigan. Donald Trump won Michigan in 2016 by just over 10,000 votes. There are 139,000 Native Americans in Michigan. No one talks about the Native vote in places like Michigan or Wisconsin, where there are 86,000 Native people, and Arizona, where there's 353,000 Native people. And so in these, specifically Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona, where we're seeing this violence, where we're seeing these tactics of taking people off of voter rolls, questioning their IDs, and it is in federal law that tribal IDs are used. You can board an airplane in the United States with a tribal ID, but now they're questioning that for voting. And all of these things are happening. And where do you think they're going to start to intimidate folks? People who are living near the borders of reservations, because as Nazita said, the violence is there and it's coming towards us and people are getting intimidated. And if I know most of our audience today is maybe not in the United States, but if anyone is in the United States, please don't get intimidated and just go out and practice your right to vote, because people have worked very, very hard over the last 100, 200 years to get this right to vote. And so it's serious and important.
Absolutely, thank you. I've got a question that's come in from Ross Snyder, who says, it seems like the Republican Party has become increasingly defined by a threatened white identity. Do you think that that changes if they lose the 2020 election, or is whiteness too much of a central part of American politics?
Well, that movement is something that dates back to the realignments of the parties as the Southern Dixiecrats became Republicans in response to the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Housing Equality Act, and through the campaigns that then followed of Nixon, Reagan, through the Bush years, both Bushes, and into Trump. I think that there are moments and times where it can become easy to think of Donald Trump as an aberration, but rather Donald Trump is a reflection of the politics of decades of Republican policy and rhetoric. And so it does seem, and what we've seen at various junctures has been that the establishment of the party has at times attempted to address and curb this, be it steps taken during the George W. Bush administration, be it the 2012 autopsy by the Republicans, in which they explicitly called for an abandonment of such coarse rhetoric and an embrace of racial minorities looking towards the future. But the reality is the meat and potatoes, the base of the party, is not in line with that. In the United States of America, we have one racially monochromatic party and one racially diverse party. And that dynamic creates all types of ripples in both directions. It's one of the reasons the Democrats eat themselves alive constantly, is because they're actually a party of a bunch of different types of people with different interests and different beliefs and different ideas. And it's also one of the reasons the Republicans have such difficulty winning in increasingly diverse places. Republicans can't win in cities, in population centers. It's exacerbated our rural-urban divides. We see this now culturally. You know, there's the book by Bill Bishop called The Big Sort, in which we look at the ways in which we now are physically grouped by partisan identification. We are interacting less in our normal lives with people of deeply divergent political ideology because there is now such space and such gap between us that we want different things in the places where we live. And so, look, I don't think that again, Donald Trump losing an election does not begin to address that, in part because Donald Trump remains the leader of the Republican Party. He's the outgoing president with one of the largest microphones in all of politics and in all of the world. And it's hard to imagine he doesn't spend the next 4 years talking about running again. But beyond that, these ideas, be it nativism, be it fear mongering about Muslims or Black people or crime, punitive criminal justice policies, all of those things long predate Donald Trump. And so it's a mistake to think that he is in some ways, like Trumpism is just Republicanism. And I think that we ought to misunderstand that in the way we have these conversations.
Maria, perhaps if I come to you.
Yeah, I think that the identity, American identity, is a huge can of worms. And it is kind of built on a colonial framework of domination over this land and folks who were already here or may come to it for any particular reason. And so I think that that's going to be difficult to overcome. But, I think that there's that saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I think there are not as many squeaky wheels as we think there might be. There are just some very loud voices at this moment. And a majority of the white folks in America are not espousing those beliefs, but there are some very, very loud voices right now.
For those of you who haven't heard of Ashley Jardina's book, White Identity Politics, I would highly suggest sort of consulting it, because I think Ashley has really persuasively shown that white identity is here, and she's shown us what the roots of it are, and she's shown us that it's here to stay, and that it's politically consequential. And I think that, Maria and Wesley kind of give us a really great framework for what to expect moving forward. It's doubtful that even if there is no Trump presidency, that these cleavages along racial lines will dissipate. I don't see that happening, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that there's more that unites us than divides us, and I'm optimistic in the American people and finding unity and sources of acceptance and belonging. And so I think that I agree with Maria, right, that there are some very loud voices, but I especially am optimistic because of our youth. I am just so incredibly encouraged by the youth turnout that we've already seen so far. In Michigan, my home state of Michigan, right, we have, I think it was about 10,000 almost young voters between the ages of 18 and 29 in 2016, and we're over 100,000 now in Michigan. And so I just think there is a generation of young people who are growing up and entering the voting public who are just finding ways to exercise their voice. And I think we can't discount them. Their understanding of what the future of America looks like, I think is very encouraging.
Excellent. Well, I guess to pick up on that optimistic tone there, we have a question from Sarah. She says, in a scenario where the Democrats win the Senate as well as the White House, how should they approach the Supreme Court and all other organs of American politics in future decisions on affirmative action, Muslim American rights, voting rights? I don't know if anyone would like to take that one first. Perhaps Nazita?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to realize that a lot of what was done during the Trump presidency came through executive order, one by one, by one, by one. And so, for instance, at least with immigration, I believe there were over 400 executive orders, and they're still coming, and to undo these will take time. And so I think I think, a lot of us are optimistic that, with a Biden presidency, we're just going to shut down for 2 months. COVID is going to go away. We're going to be okay. We'll reverse everything in the first week and it'll be back. We'll pretend it didn't happen. We'll all heal and we'll kind of hold hands and it'll be over. But that's just simply not true. There are a number of legal barriers that have been created, and to undo any of this, I think will depend not only on time, but also on the composition of other branches of government as well. The kind of support that the Democratic Party has on election day. And so this is why the Senate races are so critical right now. A lot of Democratic money is being sort of channeled away from the presidential election and into these Senate races, because there is a very critical understanding that, if the kind of change that you're talking about, Sarah, with respect to these issues is going to happen, it just can't be through the executive. That's just not A, feasible, and B, legitimate. So I think there's a lot of efforts being put there, and I just kind of want to just temper our expectations somewhat for myself, but for all of us in general.
Yeah, and to that point, I was working in DC in policy for the first 2 years of the Trump administration. And I remember it was probably a year in, and I was sitting around with some very knowledgeable people who know the ins and outs, the nitty gritty, that you would think can just first week with a pen be undone. And folks were saying, wow, there's a lot of tweets, there's a lot of media, whatever, but the Trump administration is actually being very effective of getting their policies into enacted through the executive branch. And so it is going to take a while to address those types of things. And also just to remind folks that there's a whole legislative session between the election and the inauguration of the lame duck session. And so a lot of things can happen during that time. And that's when the major spending bill usually comes down. All of the funding for the government, all of those shutdown type of negotiations, that's the bill that those happen from. And even if there is a Democratic landslide in November, there still could be, Amy Coney Barrett could still be on the Supreme Court. That is a complete, very possible possibility. And so there's a lot that can happen in the next week, but also in the next 3 months. And also the first 100 days of any new administration, you never know what's gonna happen. And big things can happen, small things can happen. And it's pretty crazy.
Wesley?
Sure. I'm not gonna. I won't prognosticate about what they should do. To echo what my colleagues here have said, the first is that it's the probability that Amy Coney Barrett will be on the Supreme Court. There's no legislative obstruction to that. They have the votes and they might be taking them as soon as this week. And that will, I think Vice President Biden has said that if he's elected, his plan is to create a commission to review judicial reform and look at the courts. That could very well end up with additional people on the Supreme Court. It could not. I think that in a world in which there's a Democratic administration, there's going to be a series of pressures. First and foremost, because the relatively united coalition of the left ends the day after the election. That suddenly there is going to be a massive internal fight over things like cabinet positions and priorities. You have a handful of constituencies who want big, major movement and want it immediately. They want to see major movement on climate change. You want to see major movement on immigration and immigration reform. You want to see massive undoings of several significant Trump steps. There's going to be pressure as it relates to the cabinet over who is represented there, and it's going to be interesting to see what steps a theoretical President Biden would take, who he would surround himself with. And so there is there are a lot of challenges. By the way, we're certainly still going to be living within a pandemic. And so there's going to be real and active, real time state of emergency happening. And I think that we can't underestimate the extent to which that remains something that takes up a lot of time and resource and energy for anyone and everyone. And so, first and foremost, you got to make sure people aren't dying. And so, I think that it's going to be remarkably complicated. And like I said, I think a lot of that complication is going to be driven by the fact that suddenly a lot of groups that have held their fire are going to feel the need to publicly pressure the administration.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our hour. So I'd just like to say on behalf of the audience listening, thank you very much to our three panelists for their time tonight. It's obviously an incredibly busy time of the year, so putting our hands together in front of Zoom screens all over the world. But thank you very much to each of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming along too. We have the next event is on a Friday, featuring Claire Malone from 538 and Bob Schrum and Mike Murphy, the consultant. So we hope to see you there. And thank you once again. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
Everyone.